For many years, fortune was benevolent to him, and only before his death it turned its back on its favorite. The name of this navigator was Jean-François de Comte de Lapérouse. He was born in Leguaux in the south of France in 1741. The son of an aristocrat, he grew purposeful and inquisitive. He was fond of natural sciences and became engrossed in reading books about sea voyages. And though the prospect of being a naval officer didn't promise a comfortable life every day and a quiet, safe life, François was not afraid to take a risk. At the age of 18, he took part in a marine battle on the 7 Years' War. In spite of his young age, François fought with the enemy bravely and was wounded, and while in captivity was able to run away and return to his service. In 1782, the squadron commanded by Lapérouse attacked British forts on the coast of the Hudson Bay. It was the most difficult of all my campaigns, François admitted in a letter to his mother. For his bravery, François was awarded a sword with his name engraved on the handle. By the age of 40, the brave naval officer had had 18 campaigns and received a special award, the Order of St. Louis. Lapérouse's fearlessness attracted the attention of Louis XVI, who wanted to organize an expedition to the Great Southern Sea, as the Pacific Ocean was called at that time. To enhance France's prestige and extend its territory, discoveries that would eclipse the achievements of James Cook, the British voyager, were necessary. The king decided that the experienced sailor Lapérouse was the most suitable leader for a 3-year research expedition. The destiny always protected Lapérouse, and nobody doubted that the captain would cope with the task brilliantly as usual. On the 1st of August, 1785, Boussole and the Astrolabe, 2 well-equipped ships, left Brest, a seaport in the northwest of France. Lapérouse's expedition headed for the southwest through the Atlantic, rounded South America, and entered the Pacific Ocean. In addition to the 200 sailors, there were astronomers, geologists, botanists, cartographers, and artists aboard. But the long navigation was impossible without losses. 20 people perished while they measured the depth of the ocean. And in the island of Samoa, savages armed with bludgeons killed 12 French sailors and the captain of the Astrolabe, Perrault de Langley. Nevertheless, in July of 1787, the expedition reached Sakhalin. At that time, the natives called the land Tapshoka, but Captain Lapérouse named it Saghalin. On the maps of that period, Sakhalin and Hokkaido were shown as one island. Rounding it from the south, Lapérouse found that there were 2 islands divided by the ocean. Afterwards, the strait between Sakhalin and Hokkaido received the name of its discoverer, Lapérouse. In the Avachin Bay, the captain visited Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. During the mooring, Lapérouse received letters from France, and among them there was a notification of the decision to give him the rank of admiral and an order to go to Australia. Before continuing the voyage, Jean-François Lapérouse sent scientific reports they wrote and maps and the logbook to France. His mate Barthélemy de Lesseps, carrying the materials of the expedition, got home by land in more than a year, but he became the only member of the expedition who was fated to survive. And meanwhile, Boussole and the Astrolabe sailed south. In January of 1788, the ships dropped anchor in Australia's Botany Bay, where Sydney is situated now. From that place, Lapérouse sent a letter to the French Minister of Marine. The captain informed the minister about his intention of going to New Caledonia. On the 10th of March, 1788, Lapérouse's ships left Botany Bay. 3 years passed, but there was no news of Lapérouse. The searching expedition didn't bring any information about the admiral and his ships either. 36 years later, an Irish merchant saw the handle of Lapérouse's sword engraved with his name in the hands of an aborigine in one of the islands of Santa Cruz. The natives told that many years ago, 2 ships had floundered on the reef off the coast. But many sailors reached the island and settled near their aborigines. The last survivor of the shipwreck had died only 2 years before the Irish arrived. Whether it was Lapérouse himself is still a mystery. One thing is known for sure: he gave the sea not only his energy and bravery, but also his life. And Providence that protected him for so many years during the war turned out to be helpless in a peaceful voyage. And who knows what other discoveries made by Jean-François de Lapérouse went to the bottom with his frigates.
He realized Columbus's ambition and reached the eastern lands sailing westward. But this voyage cost him his own life. The success of his journeys was the highest achievement of the age of great geographic discoveries. But the man who started the rebellion on his ship got the laurels of the winner. Ferdinand Magellan was born in a Portuguese maritime province in 1480 and loved the sea from his childhood. At the age of 12, the offspring of an impoverished noble family became a page in the Queen's suite. But instead of court etiquette and fencing, the gloomy, unsociable teenager was interested in astronomy, navigation, and cosmography. Magellan, who was thick-set and stocky, looked like a peasant and didn't resemble the offspring of knights. Like many short people, he was ambitious. Believing that a man could be appreciated for his deeds and not for his appearance or title, the 25-year-old Ferdinand exchanged the job in court for service in the army. He was among the 1,500 volunteers set out for the East to take part in the campaign. Courageous and reasonable, Magellan was promoted to the rank of an officer, but the wound in his leg made him limp for life and forced him to retire. After 7 years in field, Magellan returned home without money and honors. The captain then sat in the secret archive of King Manuel for hours. And on the ancient map of the German geographer, Martin Beheim, he accidentally found a strait that connected the Atlantic Ocean with the Southern Sea that was unknown then. After this, Magellan had a dream. He wanted to use this strait to sail from the east to the west around the globe and to discover the shortest route to India and to the Spice Islands. At that time, pepper and nutmeg were worth their weight in gold. If one had them, it was possible for him to buy land or give a dowry. Rich people were even called a sack of pepper. But for the King of Portugal, Magellan's project of sending his ships to India around Africa seemed to be a risky proposition. Then the 37-year-old officer went to the court of the Spanish King Charles and assured him that the expedition would be a success. On the 20th of September 1519, the fleet, consisting of 5 ships, left Seville. After crossing the Atlantic Ocean, Magellan's ships went south along the American coast for 4 months, trying to find the coast. But it was of no avail. The information given in secret maps seemed to be false. In March 1520, Magellan was trapped in the area of the Antarctic storms, and he decided to stay the winter on the coast of Patagonia. But that night, a mutiny broke out on 3 ships. The Spanish officers thought that it was disgraceful for them to obey the Portuguese captain and insisted on returning to Spain. Magellan didn't want to quell the rebellion through bloodshed. He even organized a show trial, forgave the sailors, but ordered 2 captains to be executed. On the 21st of October, 1520, after a tenacious search, the expedition managed to find a narrow rocky strait between Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. Magellan gave it the name All Saints Channel, but later it was called the Strait of Magellan. But then the voyage became dramatic. For more than a month, Magellan's fleet roamed around numerous branches of the strait and risked hitting reefs all the time. One ship broke in the storm. Another ship, which was loaded, proceeded to Spain through treacherous seas. When the 3 remaining ships were able to leave the strait, the ocean was sunny and calm, so it was called the Pacific. But a long route lay ahead to the west. They sailed for 4 months without fresh water and provisions. The sailors who were hungry and had the scurvy ate ox hides taken from the strips of the sails and wormy zweebacks. The smartest men even caught rats and sold them to their fellows, taking a golden half-ducat from them. At last, the expedition reached the Philippines. They could have stocked food and sailed to the Moluccas or the Spice Islands. But Magellan went to the Aborigines and tried to convert them to Christianity. The admiral didn't pay attention to bad omens. The howl of the dogs and the raven croaking over his head did not frighten him. Magellan counted upon the obedience of the islanders and thought that they would be intimidated by the sight of cannons. Unlike other Spanish conquerors, he didn't want bloodshed. Magellan underestimated the bellicose indigenes and was killed on the 21st of April, 1521. The savages dismembered his body and buried it in different parts of the island of Mactan. Only 18 sailors from the populous expedition on the ship, led by the former rebel Sebastian Elcano, returned, bringing the spices to the native harbor in 1522. The first circumnavigation lasted 3 years. It was described in detail by Antonio Pigafetta, a member of the expedition. The officers who survived the voyage accused the late Magellan of betrayal of the Spanish king. Elcano got the fame for being the discoverer. He received the coat of arms on which the globe was depicted, surrounded by the words, "You were the first to round me." And the strait discovered by Magellan was dangerous for ships. It was not used, and then it was not even drawn on the maps. But the first circumnavigation, whose life and soul was Magellan, discredited any doubts that the Earth has the shape of a sphere once and for all. The Earth's revolution round its axis was proved. For the first time, Europeans crossed the biggest of the oceans, the Pacific. The strait was discovered, and the issue named for Ferdinand Magellan, the organizer of the daring project of the first circumnavigation. Some people consider him to be the greatest prophet and clairvoyant. Others suppose that he was an impostor and a charlatan, and still others call him the predecessor of Herbert Wells, Arthur Clarke, and the first futurologist of an apocalyptical kind. But whoever he was, it's impossible to deny that Michael Nostradamus, the physician and prophet, influenced the European civilization strongly. On December 24, 1503, a boy was born in the family of hereditary physicians and scientists. His name was Michael de Notre Dame. His family professed Judaism and had only adopted Christianity some years before his birth. At the age of 18, the gifted youth became Bachelor of Arts, then graduated from the medical department of Montpellier University and secured doctor's degree of medicine. He traveled all over France for some years as a wandering physician, and then he got married and settled down in Agen and became the father of 2 kids. For the next 3 years, he enjoyed his family ideal. Then there was the catastrophe in 1538. In Agen, an epidemic broke out, and the physician suffered a great tragedy in the struggle against it. His whole family died. Nobody wanted to go to the doctor who hadn't been able to save even his dearest people. The last blow for Michael was an order to come to an inquisitor for interrogation. For 6 years, he wandered around Italy, Northern Africa, and Palestine, a broken-hearted man, perfecting himself in his skill, helping all those who needed his help and not staying too long anywhere. In Marseille, 43-year-old Michael de Notre Dame had to fight a pneumonic plague epidemic, and a year later, in Acts, his medical skills and expertise saved thousands of people stricken with cholera. The inhabitants of the saved towns greeted him by paving flowers along his way, and the Parliament of Acts rewarded him with a lifelong pension. Instead of enemas and blood transfusions that were usual for his time, Dr. Michael de Notre Dame used a method which we call phytotherapy nowadays. His miraculous ointments made of cloves and rose petals had a strong antiphlogistic effect. By 1547, Dr. de Notre Dame had become a respected and wealthy man. He settled down in the city of Salon-de-Creux, became the owner of a hotel, and married for the second time. But he began to get terrible and ominous visions while working in the silence of his study room. He considered them not to be hallucinations, but a charisma, and in 1551, he decided to publish them as an astrological almanac that is in the form habitual for his contemporaries. It was on the cover of this almanac that the pseudonym Nostradamus appeared for the first time. And in 1555, the book Centuries, Prophecies of Magister Michael Nostradamus was published. It was the unprecedented in occultism history collection of prophecies written in the form of quatrains, ponderous and obscure. The book appeared to be a real bestseller, but the foreteller achieved his real fame after one of his bloody prophecies had come true. The young lion will overcome the older one. In a field of combat, in a single fight, he will pierce his eyes in their golden cage, 2 wounds in one, then he dies a cruel death. 4 years later, King Henry II was wounded lethally in a knight's tournament. His adversary's spear hit him in the eye, through a slot of his gold visor that was to protect the king's head. This exact coincidence impressed everybody greatly, and Nostradamus gained the reputation of a man who worked wonders. His contemporaries assigned dozens of prophecies that had come true. For example, his prediction of the French throne to a youth Henry Bourbon of the Pope's tiara, to an unknown monk the undying fame to François Rabelais. Catherine Medici, the Queen of France, who was vividly interested in occult sciences, invited Nostradamus to her court, but the foreteller spent only 10 days there before escaping, confused and scared because of backside court intrigues. Nostradamus used to work mainly at nights in his clandestine study where nobody was allowed access. He slept for not more than 4 hours a day. According to his contemporaries, Michael was always with a smile and was laconic, observant, and patient. He devoted a lot of time to fasts and prayers, treated poor people free of cost. With his own money, he financed a canal that turned the Creux Plain into a flourishing valley. Nevertheless, he was accused of being close to the devil and was considered to be conceited and an alcoholic. He was lonely during the last stages of his life. His family failed to understand him. He suffered from intrigues and hate of his enemies. Nostradamus died on July 2nd, 1566, at 3 in the morning. He had crossed this day out of his calendar with his own hand some days before his death. When a regular cataclysm happens, we find the event in Nostradamus's quatrains, but none of his predictions was deciphered beforehand. Thus, the prophecies of the October Revolution and the act of terrorism on September 11th were ascribed to Nostradamus. For a great German poet, Goethe Nostradamus became the prototype of Faust. the scientist who sold his soul for stealthy knowledge, who used to come into the clandestine study of the old doctor Michael de Notre Dame and the prophet Nostradamus, an evil angel or the messenger of God? We will never know.
His work on mathematics, titled The Principia, can be considered the most called-for manual among all ever created. But his modesty played a cruel trick on the scientist. It was, though, for a long time that such a person as Euclid had never existed, and many wise men were behind his name. It is hard to believe that one person was able to systematize and polish all mathematical knowledge accumulated by the classical scientists by the 3rd century BC. Very little was known about the life of Euclid. The first interpreter of his works, the 5th century thinker Proclus, could not state exactly the dates of Euclid's birth and death. Some biographical data was preserved on the pages of an Arabic manuscript from the 12th century. Euclid, the son of Naucratis, Greek by origin, Syrian according to the place of residence, comes from the town of Tyre near Athens. It is also known that the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid lived in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC and headed the department of mathematics in the library. In the Hellenic age, Alexandria was the center of cultural life in Egypt. There was a majestic palace of science museum, the Temple of Muses in Alexandria. It was the largest scientific center with an astronomical observatory, a botanical garden, a zoo, and a library. The King Ptolemy I tried to make his state famous not by wars, but by achievements in science and culture. He invited the geographer Eratosthenes, the poet Apollo of Rhodes, the satirist Lucian, and the mathematician Euclid to work in Alexandria. In those days, scientific work was becoming a recognized occupation, and scientists received considerable monetary rewards. But modest and hardworking Euclid did not require any benefits for himself. Mathematics was the main point for his life. About 325 BC, Euclid completed a fundamental work consisting of 13 books under a common title, The Principia. The basics of stereometry, planometry, and algebra are given here. The legend says that Euclid the teacher was of gentle disposition. His nature was mild like wax. He devoted all his energy to making his pupils work hard. They say that one of the youngsters, having learned only some theorems, was tired and asked Euclid, "What will I have for learning all of this?" After this, Euclid called a slave and said, "Bring him 3 coins. This poor creature wants to earn on his studies." However, some historians attribute audacity towards a royal person to reserve Euclid. Ptolemy I, who gathered around him famous scientists from all over the world, decided one day to read the Principia, written by Euclid for his pupils. But the science was difficult for the king to learn. Once he asked Euclid, "Isn't there a shorter way to study geometry?" And the scientist proudly replied, "There are no royal ways in geometry." Almost all the postulates set forth by the mathematician in his work had been well known before Euclid, including the theorem about the sum of a triangle's corners and Pythagoras' theorem. But only a scrupulous and thoughtful scientist as Euclid managed to systematize and explain them in such a way that each subsequent theorem logically stemmed from the previous one. He added the missing fragments and developed proofs. Such basic notions as point, A straight line and a triangle were presented by Euclid as axioms in example statements that do not require proofs. Euclid's unique Principia became a means to brain training and logical thinking. Scientists assume that for mankind they meant even more than Aristotle's treatises on logic. The Principia gave an impetus to the development of modern science. It served as a foundation of mathematical reasoning of Galileo, Newton, Copernicus, and Kepler. In 1687, Isaac Newton wrote his basic work, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, in the same form as Euclid's Principia. In 1826, using the works of Euclid, Nikolai Lobachevsky created the first non-Euclidean geometry, which was a revolution in the idea of the nature of space. In 1913, using the logical reasoning suggested by E. Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead, published the work on mathematical logic, Foundations of Mathematics. Classical wisdom says that a mathematician should be a good poet. However, Euclid did not write verses. He loved music, but he considered even music through the prism of mathematics. He placed the tasks about musical intervals in the work The Section of Canon. Today, the scientists admit that Euclid's geometry does not give a full picture of the world in some cases. For instance, it is not always exact in reference to the boundless spaces of the universe. But even the latest achievements of science only emphasize the role of the great ancient Greek geometrician Euclid in the development of mathematics. Many copies of his main work were made by hard-working scribes of different countries. With the invention of book printing, Euclid's Principia was published 2,500 times, and now it is considered to be the most popular written monument of antiquity after the Bible.
The ancient epic poem Iliad by Homer describes the magnificent and beautiful city of Troy, which was robbed by the Achaean Greeks and burned down to ashes in 1200 BC. Till the 19th century, archaeologists had been trying to find Troy, but to no effect, and many considered it to be a poetic fantasy. The ancient city was found by an amateur for whom archaeology was only a childish dream. The life of the legendary Troy discoverer, Heinrich Schliemann, is a fascinating novel full of shipwrecks, romantic stories, and precious findings. Henry Schliemann had to make his living since he was 14. He was an errand boy at a shop, a docker, and then he decided to look for happiness in America. But the ship sank. Schliemann was saved by some miracle and found himself on the Dutch shore with only ragged pants on and an old blanket around his shoulders. But even in the most painful moments of his life, he kept remembering an episode of his childhood. At Christmas time, Heinrich was given a wonderful gift, an illustrated world history for children. The boy was fascinated by a story about the glorious Troy, an ancient city with strong fortress walls and the dazzling palace of King Priam. The 8-year-old Henry swore to find the beautiful city glorified by Homer. In Amsterdam, the youth was saved from starvation by an old friend's letter of recommendation. Heinrich became a messenger in one of the trading houses. After his first pay, he bought a volume of Homer and an English grammar textbook. He worked from sunrise to sunset. He did not heat his room, but he learned languages. In 1 year's time, Schliemann acquired a good command over English, French, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, and Spanish. By the end of his life, he had known 15 languages. The polyglot messenger was promoted as a clerk. Under his firm's instruction, he began to learn Russian. The source of his Russian Lexis was said to have been the unquotable verses of a certain Barkov, whose volume he had bought in a bookshop. In Petersburg, Schliemann's commercial talent thrived. He made his first million. He was not always honest in his dealings.